The stone floor of the palace corridor was cold beneath Ilara's knees as she scrubbed away the remnants of the evening's feast, her hands raw and trembling from hours of labor that never seemed to end. She had learned long ago not to look up when the alphas passed by, not to meet their eyes or acknowledge their existence beyond a deeper bow of her head. Omegas like her were meant to be invisible, silent shadows that kept the palace running while the powerful ones made their grand declarations and political maneuvers. The hierarchy was absolute in the Silvercrest Kingdom, carved into law by centuries of alpha dominance, and to question it meant death or worse, exile to the wastelands where rogues tore apart anyone too weak to defend themselves. Ilara had survived 23 years by making herself smaller, quieter, less noticeable than the dust she swept away each morning before dawn broke over the mountains. But tonight, something felt different. A tension in the air that made her wolf stir restlessly beneath her skin in a way it never had before. The guards who usually ignored her completely were watching her with unusual intensity, their eyes tracking her movements as she moved from corridor to corridor with her bucket of filthy water and her worn scrub brush. She told herself it was nothing, that she was imagining the hostility in their gazes. But when 3 of them cornered her in the eastern wing, where no one ever ventured after dark, she understood with horrible clarity that her invisibility had finally failed her. The largest one, a beta named Garrick, who had always enjoyed tormenting the weaker pack members, grabbed her by the hair and slammed her against the wall hard enough that stars exploded across her vision, and blood filled her mouth from where she bit her tongue. They did not explain why they were doing this, did not offer any justification for the beating that followed. Perhaps they needed no reason beyond the simple fact that they could, that she was powerless to stop them, that no one would ever believe an Omega's word against theirs even if she survived long enough to speak it. Garrick's fist connected with her ribs, and she felt something crack, the pain so intense that her vision went white and her legs gave out beneath her. She hit the floor hard, her head bouncing off the stone, and through the ringing in her ears, she heard them laughing, discussing whether they should finish the job or leave her here to bleed out slowly, where someone might eventually find her body and dispose of it properly. The decision was made for them when footsteps echoed down the corridor, heavy and purposeful, accompanied by an aura of power so overwhelming that even through her fading consciousness, Ilara felt it pressing down on her like a physical weight. The guards froze instantly, their cruel amusement transforming into terror so profound that she could smell it pouring off them in acrid waves. Someone very important had just arrived, someone whose anger would mean far worse than anything they had just done to her. She managed to turn her head slightly, blood pooling beneath her cheek, and caught a glimpse of polished black boots stopping just inches from her face. Alpha King Kale Nightshade stood over her broken body, with an expression that could have carved mountains, his silver eyes blazing with a fury that made the temperature in the corridor drop by several degrees. He was legendary throughout the wolf territories, a warrior who had claimed his throne by defeating every challenger who dared question his right to rule, a king who had expanded the Silvercrest borders through centuries of strategic brilliance and ruthless efficiency. Ilara had only ever seen him from a distance, a dark figure on a throne who barely seemed to notice the servants who kept his palace running. She had certainly never expected him to notice her, and the fact that he was here now, staring down at her with an intensity that made her remaining breath catch in her throat seemed impossible. But it was not her face that held his attention. Kale's gaze was locked on the blood spreading across the stone floor. Blood that was not the deep crimson it should have been, but rather a luminous silver that seemed to glow with its own internal light, as if moonbeams had been liquefied and were now seeping from her wounds. Ilara stared at it in confusion, wondering if the head injury had damaged her vision. But the shocked gasps from the guards confirmed that they saw it too. This was not normal, was not anything that should exist in the natural world, and the implications of it crashed over her like a tidal wave, even as her consciousness began to slip away entirely. The moment her blood touched the bare stone, every wolf in the vicinity reacted with synchronized precision that defied conscious control. The 3 guards who had been beating her dropped to their knees so hard that she heard bone crack against floor, their heads bowed and their necks exposed in a gesture of absolute submission that went beyond fear or respect. It was instinct, something wired so deeply into their genetic code that they could not have resisted it even if they wanted to. Even Kale himself swayed slightly, his jaw clenched with the effort of fighting against the compulsion to bow before this broken Omega bleeding out on his palace floor. And the fact that he had to fight it at all when he was the most powerful alpha in 5 territories told Alara everything she needed to know about how drastically her life had just changed. Kale's voice, when he finally spoke, was cold enough to frost the air between them. Each word precisely measured and weighted, with barely contained violence. He asked the guards to explain themselves, to give him one good reason why he should not have them executed immediately, for daring to assault someone under his protection, and the fact that he called her that, someone under his protection, when he had never acknowledged her existence before, made it clear that he understood the significance of the silver blood, even if she did not yet. Garrick tried to stammer out some excuse about Omegas needing to be kept in their place, about maintaining proper hierarchy, but Kyle silenced him with a gesture that promised unimaginable suffering if another word passed his lips. The king dropped to one knee beside Alara, his hand hovering over her but not quite touching, as if he was afraid that contact might trigger something neither of them were prepared for. She tried to speak, to ask him what was happening to her, but her voice came out as nothing more than a wet gurgle as blood filled her throat. Kale's expression shifted then, something that might have been concern or possibly fear flickering across his features before he locked it down behind his usual mask of royal authority. He called for his personal healer, his voice carrying the unmistakable ring of command that had entire armies jumping to obey. And then he did something that shocked everyone present, including Alara herself. He gathered her broken body into his arms with a gentleness that seemed impossible from a man known for crushing his enemies' throats with his bare hands, cradling her against his chest, as if she was something precious, rather than the throwaway Omega everyone had always believed her to be. The last thing Alara remembered before darkness claimed her completely was the steady rhythm of Kale's heartbeat against her ear and the strange sensation of warmth spreading through her veins, as if her body recognized his touch in a way that transcended logic or reason. She dreamed of forests that no longer existed, and wolves that ran beneath skies filled with stars that had long since burned out, of a time before alphas and omegas when there had only been one kind of wolf, and they had all carried moonlight in their blood. She dreamed of a woman who looked like her, but stood taller, prouder, wearing a crown made of silver flames while armies bowed at her feet, and of a man who could have been Kale's twin reaching for her with hands stained in betrayal. When Alara finally clawed her way back to consciousness, she found herself in a room so luxurious that for several disorienting moments she was convinced she had actually died and somehow ended up in whatever afterlife waited for wolves. The bed beneath her was impossibly soft, covered in silks that probably cost more than her entire lifetime of wages, and the ceiling above was painted with constellations that seemed to move and shift when she stared at them too long. Healing magic hummed in the air around her, the work of someone extremely skilled and probably extremely expensive, and when she carefully probed her ribs, she found them completely healed with not even a trace of the crack she had felt splintering beneath Garrick's fists. A movement near the window drew her attention, and she turned her head to find Kale standing with his back to her, silhouetted against the early morning light streaming through glass so clear it might as well not have existed at all. He had not changed his clothes from the night before, and she could see tension radiating through every line of his powerful frame, as if he had been standing vigil all night waiting for her to wake. The realization that the Alpha King himself had spent hours watching over her unconscious form should have been flattering, or at least interesting, but instead it terrified her because men like Kyle did not waste time on people unless they wanted something, and she could not imagine what she possibly had that would interest someone who already owned everything. If you are enjoying this story and want to see where Alara's journey takes her next, please consider liking this video and leaving a comment below about what you think her silver blood might mean. Your support helps me continue creating these supernatural romance stories that explore the hidden depths of wolf-shifter society. Kyle spoke without turning around, his voice carefully neutral, in a way that told her he was working very hard to keep his emotions under control. He asked her if she knew what she was, if anyone in her family had ever exhibited the same silver blood or displayed abilities beyond what normal Omegas possessed. Elara struggled to sit up, her body still weak despite the healing that had been performed, and admitted that she knew nothing beyond what everyone else knew, that she was an Omega born to Omega parents who had died in a rogue attack when she was barely old enough to remember their faces. She had been raised in the pack orphanage with dozens of other unwanted children, trained from birth to serve the higher ranks without question or complaint, and as far as she knew, there was nothing special about her bloodline at all. Kyle finally turned to face her, and the intensity in his silver eyes made her breath catch because she had never had anyone look at her like that before, as if she was a puzzle he needed to solve before it destroyed everything he had built. He told her that she was wrong, that there was something very special about her bloodline, something that had been hidden so well that even she did not know the truth of what ran through her veins. Her blood was silver because she carried the genetic legacy of the primordials, the ancient wolves who had ruled before the current hierarchy was established, beings of such power that even the strongest modern alphas were nothing compared to what they had been capable of. The primordials had been systematically hunted to extinction over 1,000 years ago, in a purge that the history books barely mentioned, their very existence erased from collective memory because they represented a threat to the alpha power structure that had replaced them. The weight of this revelation pressed down on Elara like a physical thing, and she found herself shaking her head in denial, even though some deep part of her recognized the truth in his words. She asked him how this was possible, how she could carry such a bloodline when she had never displayed any power or ability beyond what the weakest Omega possessed. Kale moved closer to the bed, his movements controlled and predatory, in a way that reminded her he was still very much a dangerous alpha, despite the gentleness with which he had carried her. He explained that primordial blood could lie dormant for generations, hidden beneath layers of weaker genetics until something triggered its awakening, and he suspected that the trauma of the attack had been exactly the catalyst needed to bring her true nature to the surface. But knowing what she was and understanding the implications of it were two very different things, and Kale made it brutally clear what her existence meant for the carefully maintained power structure of the wolf world. If word got out that a living primordial had been found, that the supposedly extinct bloodline had survived in hiding for a millennium, it would shake the foundation of every alpha's claim to power, because their right to rule was based on the assumption that they were the strongest beings in existence. The Council of Alphas, the governing body that maintained order across all the territories, would see her as either a weapon to be controlled or a threat to be eliminated. And Kale could not predict which option they would choose, or if he could protect her from their decision. Elara felt panic rising in her chest because she had spent her entire life trying to be invisible, and now she was being told that her very existence was a political crisis waiting to explode. She asked Kyle why he was telling her this, why he had saved her at all instead of just letting the guards finish what they started and solving the problem before it could become complicated. His expression shifted into something she could not quite read, a mixture of frustration and something that might have been ancient grief. And he told her that he could not have let her die even if he had wanted to, because the moment her blood touched the floor, the moment every wolf present had bowed before her instinctively, he had felt something snap into place inside his chest like a puzzle piece that had been missing for longer than he could remember. The word hung unspoken between them, but Elara heard it anyway, felt the truth of it resonating through her bones in a way that both terrified and thrilled her. Mate. Kale was claiming that she was his fated mate, that their souls were bound together by forces older than either of them, and the bitter irony of it would have made her laugh if she had any laughter left in her. The most powerful alpha in the kingdom was destined for the weakest Omega, except she was not actually weak at all, but rather something that could potentially destroy everything he had built. And now they were both trapped in a situation where neither could walk away, even if that would be the smart choice. Kale confirmed her suspicions with a slight nod, his jaw tight with tension, that spoke of how much he hated being controlled by something as unpredictable as a mate bond. He told her that he had lived for over 300 years without finding his fated mate, and had long ago assumed he would rule and eventually die alone. But the moment he had scented her blood, everything inside him had roared to life with a possessive certainty that overrode centuries of careful, emotional control. He could not let her go, could not hand her over to the council even though that would be the politically expedient choice, because every instinct he possessed screamed at him to protect her regardless of the cost. But protection came with conditions, and Kale was not the kind of man who sugar-coated uncomfortable truths. He told Alara that she would need to stay in the palace under his direct supervision, that she could not return to her former life or contact anyone from her past because the danger was too great. He would assign guards to watch her at all times, not as prisoners, but as protectors, and she would need to begin training immediately to learn how to control whatever powers were awakening inside her, before they manifested in ways that could not be hidden or explained away. She was effectively being placed under house arrest for her own safety, her freedom sacrificed on the altar of political necessity, and the fact that Kale seemed genuinely conflicted about this did nothing to make it more palatable. Alara wanted to argue, to demand her autonomy and refuse to be locked away like some precious treasure that needed guarding. But she was also not stupid enough to ignore the very real danger Kyle was describing. She had seen what happened to wolves who challenged the established order, had watched from the shadows as dissenters were made examples of, in ways designed to ensure no one else would dare follow their path. If the council decided she was a threat, they would not simply kill her quickly, but rather make her death a public spectacle, meant to remind everyone what happened to those who disrupted the natural hierarchy. And she had no desire to become a cautionary tale told to frighten young wolves into obedience. So she agreed to Kale's terms with the understanding that this was temporary, that once they figured out what her powers were and how to control them, they would revisit the conversation about her freedom. Kale accepted her conditions with a slight inclination of his head that might have been respect, or possibly just acknowledgement, and then he did something unexpected by reaching out and taking her hand in his much larger one. His skin was warm against hers, and she felt electricity jump between them at the contact, the mate bond singing with approval at even this simple touch. He told her that he knew this was not the life she would have chosen, that being mated to him came with complications and dangers she never asked for, but he promised that he would do everything in his considerable power to keep her safe, even if that meant going to war with the very council he had helped establish. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and Alara found herself believing him despite every reason she had to be skeptical. Kyle released her hand and moved toward the door, pausing with his fingers on the handle to inform her that his most trusted advisor would be arriving shortly to begin her education on primordial history and what little was known about their abilities. He suggested she rest while she could, because the coming days would be difficult, as she learned to embrace a heritage that had been deliberately erased from all historical records. And then he was gone, leaving her alone in a room that was both prison and sanctuary, depending on how she chose to view it. The advisor who arrived an hour later was not what Alara expected, though she was not sure what she had been expecting in the first place. Lydia was an ancient she-wolf, whose silver hair hung past her waist, and whose eyes held the kind of wisdom that only came from surviving things that should have killed lesser beings. She moved into the room, with a grace that belied her obvious age, and settled into the chair beside Alara's bed, as if they were old friends meeting for tea, rather than strangers forced together by extraordinary circumstances. Lydia's first words were to ask Alara how much she knew about the true history of their kind, not the sanitized version taught in pack schools, but the real story that had been buried beneath centuries of alpha propaganda. Alara admitted that she knew almost nothing, that Omegas were not exactly encouraged to pursue education beyond what was necessary for their service roles, and Lydia's expression darkened with an anger that seemed directed at the system, rather than at Alara herself. The old wolf began to speak, and the story she told was nothing like the history Alara had been taught, was in fact so radically different that if anyone else had been telling it, she would have dismissed it as fantasy or delusion. According to Lydia, the wolf shifters had not always been divided into the rigid hierarchy of alphas, betas, and omegas that currently define their society. In the beginning, All wolves had been equal in power and status, their strength determined by individual merit and the purity of their connection to the moon, rather than by genetic designation assigned. At birth, the primordials had been the first wolves, blessed directly by the moon goddess herself, with abilities that made them nearly immortal and powerful beyond modern comprehension. They could control the elements, could heal mortal wounds with a touch, could communicate across vast distances through the bond all wolves shared with the moon. And most significantly, they could see the threads of fate that connected all living things and manipulate them to prevent disasters or guide their people toward prosperity. They had ruled wisely for thousands of years, creating a society where every wolf, regardless of their individual strength, was valued and protected, where the strong lifted up the weak, rather than subjugating them. But power, even when wielded with good intentions, inevitably attracted those who wanted it for themselves, and a faction of the strongest primordials began to believe that their superior abilities meant they deserved superior status. These dissenters started calling themselves alphas, claiming that natural selection demanded a hierarchy where the powerful ruled and the weak served, and they slowly converted others to their way of thinking through a combination of persuasive rhetoric and carefully orchestrated demonstrations of what could be accomplished when strength was concentrated rather than distributed. The division within primordial society grew wider with each passing generation, until it finally erupted into civil war that lasted for decades and devastated the wolf territories. Subscribe to this channel to follow Alara's journey as she uncovers the truth about her heritage and discovers whether she and Kale can overcome the sins of their ancestors to build something new. The war ended not with victory for either side, but with genocide. The self-proclaimed alphas realized they could not defeat the full-blooded primordials in open combat, so they resorted to treachery instead, poisoning water supplies with a substance that suppressed primordial abilities and made them vulnerable to conventional weapons. They hunted down every primordial they could find and slaughtered them wholesale, making special effort to kill the children who had not yet learned to defend themselves, ensuring the bloodline would die out completely. Those who survived went into hiding, diluting their genetics by mating with the weaker wolves and praying that their descendants might escape notice by appearing completely ordinary. The alphas then rewrote history to erase all evidence of what they had done, portraying themselves as the natural rulers who had always been destined to lead wolf society. They created the Omega designation for the weakest wolves, institutionalizing the oppression that primordials would have never tolerated, and built a power structure designed to ensure that no one would ever again be strong enough to challenge their authority. They succeeded so completely that even most modern alphas had no idea that their right to rule was based on genocide and historical revisionism, genuinely believing that the hierarchy was natural law rather than constructed tyranny. Alara listened to this history with growing horror because it recontextualized everything she had ever been taught about her place in the world. She had been told her entire life that Omegas were weak because that was simply their nature, that they needed alphas to protect and guide them because they were incapable of taking care of themselves, and she had internalized this message so deeply that she had never thought to question it. But if Lydia was telling the truth, if the hierarchy was artificial rather than natural, then the suffering and subjugation of Omegas was not inevitable, but rather a choice made by those in power to maintain their dominance, and that realization filled her with a rage she had never allowed herself to feel before. Lydia seemed to sense the shift in Alara's emotions, and reached out to place a weathered hand over hers, her touch grounding and steady. She told Alara that anger was appropriate, that it would in fact be concerning if she was not angry after learning how thoroughly she and millions of others had been lied to. But that rage without direction was just another form of helplessness. What mattered now was not dwelling on the injustices of the past, but rather deciding what Alara wanted to do with the power that was awakening inside her, whether she would hide it away to stay safe or embrace it fully and risk everything to create change. Before Alara could formulate a response to this impossible question, the door to her room burst open, and Kale strode in with an urgency that immediately put her on alert. His expression was thunderous, and she could see the tension radiating through his frame like a coiled spring ready to snap. He informed them that the Council of Alphas had just received an anonymous report about a silver-blooded Omega being found in his palace, and they were demanding that he hand her over immediately for evaluation and possible containment. Someone had leaked the information despite his orders for absolute secrecy, which meant there was a traitor in his inner circle who was working against him, and now the situation had escalated far faster than he had anticipated. Kale told Alara that the council would be arriving within 2 days to personally inspect her and determine whether she represented a threat to the established order. He could delay them, but not to deny them entirely without raising suspicions that would make everything worse, which meant she had 48 hours to learn enough control over her abilities that she could convince them she was harmless and not worth their attention. It was an impossible timeline for someone who did not even know what powers she possessed, let alone how to wield them effectively. But Kale's expression made it clear that impossible was all they had to work with. Lydia immediately took charge of the situation, with the kind of decisive authority that suggested she had been preparing for this moment for longer than either Kale or Alara realized. She announced that she would begin Alara's training immediately, and that they would need complete privacy, with no interruptions for any reason. Kyle started to protest that leaving Alara unguarded was too dangerous, but Lydia cut him off with a sharp gesture and reminded him that she had survived the original primordial purge when she was barely more than a child, which meant she knew more about staying hidden and staying alive than his entire security force combined. Her tone left no room for argument, and after a moment of tense silence, Kyle conceded with obvious reluctance. But before he left, Kyle crossed the room to stand directly in front of Alara, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. He cupped her face in his hands with a gentleness that seemed at odds with the barely contained violence radiating from him, and he told her that no matter what happened with the council, he would not let them take her, even if it meant civil war, even if it cost him his throne and his kingdom. He would burn down the entire wolf world before he allowed anyone to harm his mate, and she needed to understand that his protection came with no conditions or expectations beyond her survival. The fierce possessiveness in his words should have frightened her, should have felt like just another form of control, but instead it made something warm and bright unfurl in her chest, because no one had ever fought for her before, had ever considered her worth the kind of sacrifice he was offering. Alara found herself reaching up to cover his hands with her own, holding his gaze as she promised him that she would do whatever it took to survive this, that she would not make his potential sacrifice meaningless by giving up or letting fear control her. Kale's expression softened slightly, and for just a moment she saw past the Alpha King to the man underneath, lonely and burdened by centuries of responsibility. And she understood that he needed her just as much as she needed him, even if neither of them were ready to articulate exactly what that meant yet. He pressed a kiss to her forehead, chaste and brief, but somehow more intimate than anything she had experienced before, and then he was gone, leaving her alone with Lydia to begin the most important education of her life. The training started immediately, and it was, unlike anything Alara could have imagined. Lydia did not teach her to fight or defend herself in any conventional sense, but rather focused on helping her connect with the power that had always been inside her, but that she had been unconsciously suppressing her entire life. The old wolf explained that primordial abilities were not separate from the self, but rather extensions of will and intention, that they responded to emotional truth rather than intellectual understanding. To access them, Alara would need to stop trying to be small and invisible, would need to embrace everything she had been taught to hide and let it fill her completely until there was no space left for doubt or fear. It sounded simple in theory, but proved agonizingly difficult in practice, because Alara had spent 23 years learning to compress herself into the smallest possible space, to never want anything too loudly or feel anything too intensely. Lydia pushed her relentlessly, forcing her to confront every moment of injustice and humiliation she had ever endured. Every time she had swallowed her rage and bowed her head and accepted treatment that should have been unacceptable. She made Alara speak aloud the things she had never been allowed to say, to give voice to the fury and grief and desperate longing for something more that she had been carrying silently for as long as she could remember. And slowly, painfully, Something began to shift inside Alara's chest. She felt the power stirring, not as some foreign thing invading her body, but as a part of herself that had always been there waiting for permission to exist. It started as warmth in her core and spread outward through her limbs, making her skin glow with a soft silver light that intensified the more she leaned into it rather than away from it. Lydia coached her through it, teaching her to direct the energy with intention, rather than letting it explode outward uncontrolled. And by the end of the first day, Alara could make small objects levitate and could heal minor cuts on her own skin just by focusing her will on the desired outcome. But physical abilities were only part of what it meant to be primordial, and on the second day, Lydia introduced Alara to the most dangerous and powerful gift her bloodline possessed. She called it threadsight, the ability to perceive the invisible connections that bound all living things together, and to see the paths those connections would take into the future if left undisturbed. Lydia warned her that this ability was what the alphas had feared most, because it made primordials nearly impossible to deceive or manipulate, allowed them to see betrayal coming and take action to prevent it. And that was why the Purge had been so viciously thorough in targeting anyone who displayed even the slightest hint of prophetic capability. Alara was not sure she wanted this ability, because seeing the future sounded like a burden she was not equipped to carry. But Lydia insisted that she needed to at least understand how it worked before the council arrived. The old wolf guided her into a meditative state and taught her to open her perception beyond the physical realm into the space where possibility lived. What Alara saw when she finally managed to access threadsight made her gasp and nearly broke her concentration entirely, because the world was suddenly full of silver cords connecting every person and object in an impossibly complex web that shifted and changed with each passing moment. She could see the thread that connected her to Kale, thicker and brighter than any other, pulsing with potential and possibility, but also shadowed with darkness that suggested their bond would not be an easy one. She could see threads connecting to the council members she had never met, some of them frayed and weak, while others burned with hostile intent, and she understood instinctively that these were the ones who would vote to have her destroyed. But most disturbing were the OE threads that connected to people she could not identify, shadowy figures whose intentions were hidden even from her enhanced perception, and she knew without being told that these were the ones working behind the scenes to engineer her downfall. Lydia pulled her out of the vision before she could delve deeper, explaining that threadsight was addictive and dangerous if used too frequently, because it was easy to lose yourself in the infinite possibilities and forget to live in the present moment. But even that brief glimpse had shown Alara what she was truly capable of, and it changed something fundamental in how she viewed herself and her place in the world. She was not weak, had never been weak, had only been taught to believe she was by a system designed to keep her compliant and controllable. The power had always been there, and now that she had touched it, she understood that she could never go back to pretending to be less than she was. When the Council of Alphas arrived the next morning, Alara was as ready as 2 days of intensive training could make her. Kyle had arranged for the meeting to take place in the throne room with his most trusted guards in attendance, creating an environment where he had maximum control over the proceedings. Alara walked into that room wearing a simple dress that Lydia had chosen for her. Nothing ostentatious or attention-grabbing, her hair pulled back in a style that would have been appropriate for any Omega servant. But there was something different in the way she carried herself now, a quiet confidence that had not been there before, and she saw several of the council members take note of it with varying degrees of suspicion. The council consisted of 12 alphas, representing the most powerful packs across the territories, and they arranged themselves in a semicircle facing the throne, where Kyle sat with calculated authority. Alara stood to his right and slightly behind, a position that could be interpreted as either subordinate or protective depending on the observer's perspective. The head of the council, an ancient alpha named Marcus, whose reputation for cruelty was legendary, stepped forward and demanded that Alara present herself for examination, his tone making it clear that he considered her presence an insult to the natural order. Kale's voice cut through the tension like a blade, cold and precise, as he reminded Marcus that Alara was under his personal protection, and that any examination would be conducted with her consent and his supervision. The threat underlying his words was unmistakable, and several of the council members shifted uncomfortably. clearly not anticipating that their king would so openly defy them over an Omega. Marcus's eyes narrowed, but he inclined his head in acknowledgement, rephrasing his demand as a request that Alara voluntarily demonstrate whatever abilities she possessed so that the council could properly assess whether she represented a danger to Wolf Society. This was the moment everything depended on, and Alara felt Lydia's words echoing in her mind about the importance of showing enough power to be taken seriously, but not so much that they would feel threatened enough to act against her immediately. She stepped forward, meeting Marcus's hostile gaze with calm steadiness, and she told him that she would be happy to demonstrate her abilities under one condition. She wanted assurances that regardless of what she showed them, the council would judge her based on her actions and intentions rather than on fear of what her bloodline represented, and that they would give her the opportunity to prove herself a contributing member of Wolf Society rather than assuming she was a threat simply because of genetics she had not chosen. The audacity of an Omega making demands of the council caused several members to bristle with indignation, but Marcus surprised everyone by actually considering her words. He told her that he could not promise the council would judge her fairly because fairness was subjective and she had no right to demand it. But he could promise that they would listen to her testimony and take it into account when making their final decision. It was not the assurance she wanted, but it was probably the best she was going to get. So Alara nodded her acceptance and prepared to show them exactly what she was capable of. She started small, levitating several of the weapons mounted on the throne room walls and arranging them in a complex pattern that demonstrated fine control rather than raw power. The council members watched with expressions ranging from fascination to barely concealed hostility, and she could practically hear them calculating how such an ability could be weaponized or countered. Next, she asked one of Kale's guards to create a shallow cut on his arm, and she healed it with a touch, the wound closing seamlessly as silver light flowed from her palm into his skin. This demonstration caused more of a reaction because healing abilities were extremely rare and valuable, and she saw greed flash across several faces as they reconsidered her worth. But it was the final demonstration that truly shocked them into silence. Alara asked Kale's permission to look at the threads connecting everyone in the room, and at his slight nod she opened her thread sight fully for the first time in front of an audience. She described what she saw with careful precision, pointing out the alliances and enmities that existed between various council members, exposing secrets that were supposed to be hidden, and predicting with unsettling accuracy what each person's next move would be, based on the trajectory of their threads. She made sure to include information that was verifiable rather than just making vague pronouncements, proving that her ability was genuine rather than performative. The reaction was immediate and intense. Half the council looked terrified because anyone who could see their intentions so clearly would be impossible to manipulate, while the other half looked speculative, as if they were already trying to figure out how to either recruit her or eliminate her before she became a larger problem. Marcus stared at her with an expression that might have been respect or might have been calculation, and when he finally spoke, his words carried weight that silenced the murmuring conversations breaking out around him. He told Alara that her abilities were indeed remarkable, and that they confirmed she carried genuine primordial blood, which presented the council with a unique situation that had no historical precedent to guide their decision. On one hand, she was clearly powerful enough to be dangerous if she chose to oppose the established hierarchy. On the other hand, her abilities could be incredibly valuable if properly utilized for the benefit of Wolf Society as a whole. The question was whether they could trust her to use her power responsibly, or whether she would eventually attempt to overthrow the system that had oppressed her kind for generations. Alara understood that this was her moment to either secure her survival or guarantee her execution, and she chose her words carefully. She told the council that she had no interest in overthrowing anything or seeking revenge for historical injustices, that all she wanted was the freedom to live her life without fear, and the opportunity to use her abilities to help others, rather than hiding them away like something shameful. She acknowledged that the current hierarchy had problems, that Omegas were treated unjustly, and that power was too concentrated in too few hands, but she also recognized that tearing down a system without having something better to replace it would only create chaos and suffering for everyone, including the weakest wolves who could least afford more instability. What she proposed instead was gradual reform, working within the existing structure to create more protections for lower-ranking wolves and establishing accountability measures to prevent abuses of power. She offered to use her thread sight to help identify corruption and inefficiency within the council itself, to serve as an advisor who could provide insight that no one else was capable of accessing. In exchange, she asked only for recognition of her right to exist and for the freedom to mate with whomever she chose without interference, her eyes finding Kale's as she said this last part, making it clear to everyone present exactly who she was choosing. The boldness of her proposal hung in the air as the council deliberated, and Alara could see the threads of possibility branching and shifting as various futures played out based on decisions that had not yet been made. She saw timelines where Marcus voted to execute her and Kale went to war, decimating both sides until there was nothing left of wolf civilization but ruins and regret. She saw timelines where the council accepted her proposal but sabotaged her at every turn, slowly poisoning her until her abilities failed and she died in agony while everyone claimed it was natural causes. But she also saw timelines where her presence actually did change things, where having someone who could see through political deception forced the council to operate with more integrity, and where the incremental reforms she implemented eventually grew into something that transformed wolf society for the better. Marcus called for a vote, and Alara watched the hands rise one by one, some in favor of accepting her proposal and others against it. The decision coming down to a single vote that would determine not just her fate, but potentially the future of every wolf in the territories. In the end, the vote was 7-5 in her favor, a narrow margin that guaranteed she would have enemies within the council who would work against her, but a victory nonetheless. Marcus announced that Alara would be granted provisional acceptance contingent on her continued cooperation and demonstrated loyalty to wolf society, and that she would be required to submit to periodic evaluations to ensure her abilities were not becoming a threat. It was not the unconditional acceptance she might have hoped for, but it was survival, and in that moment, survival felt like a tremendous victory. Kale's expression remained carefully neutral throughout the proceedings, but she felt the mate bond thrumming with his satisfaction and relief, and when the council finally departed, she allowed herself to breathe properly for the first time in hours. They had won this battle, but she understood that the war was far from over, that there would be challenges and obstacles she could not yet anticipate, and that her life would never be simple or peaceful as long as she carried primordial blood in a world ruled by alphas. But as Kale came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers and their fingers intertwining with a naturalness that felt like coming home, Alara decided that she was willing to fight for a future where wolves like her did not have to hide what they were or apologize for existing. She had spent too many years making herself small, and now that she had tasted what it felt like to take up space and demand recognition, she could not imagine going back to invisibility. Whatever came next, she would face it with Kale at her side, and with the full force of her abilities at her disposal, and perhaps together they could build something better than what had come before. The months that followed were a delicate dance of politics and personal growth, as Alara learned to navigate her new role as both Kale's mate and as an unofficial advisor to the council. She attended meetings where she was the only woman and the only Omega, enduring condescension and subtle attempts to undermine her credibility with a patience that surprised even herself. She used her thread sight sparingly but effectively, exposing 3 separate corruption scandals within the first 6 months that forced the council to take her seriously, even if they resented her presence. Kale was a constant source of support throughout this transition, though their relationship was not without its complications. He struggled with his alpha instincts to protect and control, while Alara fought against her ingrained Omega conditioning to submit and defer to his judgment. They argued frequently about strategy and approach, about how much risk was acceptable, and when compromise became capitulation. But they also learned to trust each other's strengths, with Kale providing political insight and tactical expertise, while Alara offered perspective that came from experiencing life at the bottom of the hierarchy he ruled. Their mate bond deepened with each passing day, the connection between them growing stronger until Alara could feel Kale's emotions as clearly as her own, and he could sense when she was troubled or afraid, even when she tried to hide it. They completed their mating ceremony in a private ritual witnessed only by Lydia, choosing to forego the traditional public spectacle because their relationship already attracted enough attention. The physical consummation of their bond was intense and transformative, their powers intertwining in ways that left them both shaken and changed. And afterward, Alara understood that they were no longer two separate beings, but rather two halves of a whole that could not exist independently without fundamental loss. The reforms Alara pushed for started small, but grew in scope as she built alliances with the more progressive council members and demonstrated the practical benefits of treating lower-ranking wolves with dignity and respect. She established educational programs for Omegas that went beyond basic service training, created legal protections against abuse that actually had enforcement mechanisms, and worked to dismantle the most egregious aspects of the hierarchy while being careful not to push so hard that she triggered a backlash that would undo all her progress. It was slow, frustrating work that required endless patience and political maneuvering, but she saw the changes taking root and knew that she was building something that would outlast her own lifetime. What do you think about Alara's approach to reforming wolf society? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more supernatural romance stories that explore complex power dynamics and transformative love. But not everyone was pleased with the changes, and Alara had expected resistance from the traditionalists who saw any modification to the hierarchy as dangerous precedent. What she had not anticipated was that the greatest threat would come from within her own bloodline, from other hidden primordials who had survived in obscurity, and who saw her public visibility as both betrayal and opportunity. They contacted her in secret, emerging from centuries of hiding to demand that she use her position to destroy the alpha power structure completely rather than reforming it, to take revenge for the genocide that had nearly exterminated their kind. And when she refused, they turned hostile with a swiftness that left her reeling. The leader of this faction was a primordial named Cassius, who was even older than Lydia, and whose abilities made Alara's look primitive by comparison. He could manipulate threads, not just to see them, but to alter them, forcing futures into existence through sheer force of will, and he had been using this power for decades to orchestrate events that would eventually destabilize the alpha hierarchy. He saw Alara as either a tool to accelerate his plans or an obstacle to be removed, and he made it clear that she had limited time to choose which role she would play. Alara brought this threat to Kale immediately, knowing that honesty was the only foundation their relationship could survive on. She told him about Cassius and the other hidden primordials, about their demands for revolution and their willingness to use violence to achieve it, and she watched his expression darken as he realized the situation was even more complicated than they had believed. Kale called an emergency council meeting and presented the information Alara had gathered, forcing the alphas to confront the reality that the primordial bloodline had not been exterminated after all, and that survivors had been working against them for longer than anyone had suspected. The council's reaction was predictably volatile, with several members immediately calling for a new purge to finish what their ancestors had started. But Alara stood before them and made an argument that she knew was risky, but that felt necessary. She told them that more violence would only perpetuate the cycle of revenge and fear that had defined wolf society for a millennium, that hunting down every primordial would require resources and create martyrs that would inspire future resistance. Instead, she proposed offering the hidden primordials the same deal she had accepted: recognition and safety in exchange for cooperation and a commitment to working within the system rather than destroying it. It was a bold suggestion that many council members immediately dismissed as naive or dangerous. But Marcus surprised everyone by supporting it. He pointed out that Alara had proven herself valuable and trustworthy, despite every reason to harbor resentment against alphas, and that extending the same opportunity to others of her kind might diffuse a threat that could otherwise grow into genuine civil war. The vote was closer this time, 6-6, with Marcus casting the tiebreaker in favor of Alara's proposal. and she felt the weight of responsibility settle even heavier on her shoulders, because now she had to convince Cassius and the others that reform was possible. The negotiation with Cassius was the most challenging conversation Alara had ever experienced because he had centuries of justified anger and no reason to trust that anything had truly changed. He showed her visions of the original purge, forced her to watch through thread sight as primordial children were slaughtered and their parents forced to watch before being killed themselves, and he demanded to know how she could advocate for cooperation with the descendants of those murderers. Alara did not try to defend the indefensible or minimize the horror of what had been done, but she argued that she was fighting for the future, not the past, that the wolves alive today were not responsible for their ancestors' crimes, and that punishing them would only create new victims. She told Cassius about the reforms she had already implemented and the resistance she had faced, proving that change was happening, even if it was slower than either of them would prefer. She offered him a position as an official primordial representative to the council, giving him power and platform to advocate for their people openly, rather than through manipulation and subterfuge. Most importantly, she reminded him that primordials had once been known for their wisdom and compassion, for building rather than destroying, and asked him if he really wanted his legacy to be perpetuating the cycle of violence that had nearly destroyed them all. The argument lasted for days, with Cassius testing her commitment and her ideals from every angle, looking for weaknesses or hypocrisy he could exploit. But Alara held firm, drawing on reserves of patience she had not known she possessed, and eventually, something shifted in Cassius's expression. He told her that she reminded him of the original primordial queens, the ones who had ruled with strength tempered by mercy, and that perhaps she was right that there were better ways to honor the dead than through revenge. He agreed to her terms on the condition that the council would formally acknowledge the genocide and establish memorials to remember what had been lost, ensuring that future generations would know the truth rather than the sanitized version history had preserved. Kyle worked with Alara to bring this proposal to the council and navigate the political landmine of asking alphas to admit historical wrongdoing. There was tremendous resistance from those who feared that acknowledging the genocide would undermine the legitimacy of their authority. But Kale argued forcefully that honesty and accountability were the only path forward that did not end in war. He reminded them that Alara could have used her abilities to manipulate them from the beginning, could have seized power through deception rather than cooperation, and the fact that she had chosen transparency should count for something. The final vote was unanimous in favor of the memorial and historical acknowledgement, though Alara knew that several council members had only agreed because refusing would have made them look guilty and afraid. But regardless of their motivations, the result was the same. A monument was erected in the capital city, listing the names of every primordial who had died in the purge, recovered through Lydia and Cassius's combined memories and thread-sight reconstruction of historical threads. The dedication ceremony was attended by thousands of wolves from all ranks, and Kale himself gave a speech acknowledging the injustice and committing the council to ensuring such atrocities would never happen again. It was a powerful moment that Alara knew was just a beginning rather than an ending, but it represented a fundamental shift in how wolf society understood its own history. The hidden primordials began emerging from secrecy, not all at once but gradually, testing the waters to see if the promises of safety and recognition would be honored. Alara worked with each one individually, helping them integrate into a world that had changed dramatically since they went into hiding, and creating a support network that would prevent isolation and provide community. As the first year of her public life drew to a close, Alara stood on the balcony of the palace looking out over the territory she now helped govern, and marveled at how completely her life had transformed. She was no longer the invisible Omega scrubbing floors and hoping to avoid notice, but rather a figure who could not walk through the capital without being recognized and approached by wolves seeking her advice or assistance. It was exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure, and there were days when she missed the simplicity of her old life, even as she acknowledged she could never return to it. Kale joined her on the balcony, sliding his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder in a gesture of casual intimacy that had become natural between them. He asked her if she regretted any of it, if she wished she could have remained hidden and anonymous, rather than bearing the weight of so much responsibility. Ilara leaned back into his embrace and considered the question seriously before answering. She told him that she would not choose differently even knowing everything that lay ahead, because living authentically with all the challenges that entailed was infinitely preferable to the half-life she had been surviving before. But she also admitted that she was afraid of failing, of not being able to live up to the expectations that had been placed on her, of making decisions that would hurt people despite her best intentions. Kale tightened his arms around her and reminded her that she did not have to carry this burden alone, that they were partners in every sense, and that her victories and failures would be theirs to share. He told her about the ancient primordial legends Lydia had shared with him, stories of queens who had ruled with their mates beside them as equals, and suggested that perhaps they could revive that tradition and create something new from the ashes of what had been destroyed. The idea of becoming a queen had never occurred to Ilara because that felt like reaching too far, like claiming status she had not earned. But Kale argued that she had already been functioning as a queen in everything but title, that the reforms she championed and the people she helped were royal duties regardless of what name was attached to them. He wanted to make it official, to crown her not as his subordinate, but as his equal partner in ruling the Silvercrest Kingdom. And the gesture meant more to her than she could articulate, because it represented his willingness to share power rather than hoard it. The coronation took place 6 months later, in a ceremony that blended traditional Alpha protocols with recovered primordial rituals, creating something entirely new that honored both their heritages. Ilara wore a crown of silver flames that seemed to burn without consuming, a primordial artifact that Cassius had preserved through centuries of hiding, and when Kale placed it on her head, she felt the weight of responsibility settle alongside a fierce pride in how far they had all come. She was Queen Ilara Nightshade now, no longer an Omega or a primordial, but rather someone who embodied both and transcended the limitations of either designation. The years that followed were not easy, because transforming an entire society never was, but they were rewarding in ways that made the struggles worthwhile. Ilara and Kale ruled together, their different perspectives and abilities complementing each other to create leadership that was both strong and compassionate. They had children who carried both alpha and primordial blood, proving that the genetic lines could merge successfully, and creating hope for a future where such distinctions mattered less than individual character. The reforms Ilara initiated continued to expand, gradually dismantling the most oppressive aspects of the hierarchy while preserving the structure and stability that prevented chaos. Omegas gained legal rights and educational opportunities that had been denied them for generations, while alphas learned that true leadership meant serving those beneath them, rather than simply commanding obedience. It was not a perfect system, and there were still injustices that needed addressing. But it was better than what had come before, and it continued improving with each passing generation. The primordials who had emerged from hiding became integrated into wolf society, contributing their abilities and wisdom while learning to live openly after so many years of concealment. Some chose to work with the council directly as Cassius did, while others focused on preserving their cultural heritage and teaching the younger generation about abilities that had been lost. Lydia established an academy where any wolf, regardless of rank, could learn about their history and potential, ensuring that knowledge would never again be hoarded by those in power or deliberately erased by those who found it threatening. And through it all, Ilara and Kale's bond remained the foundation that everything else was built upon. Their love was not the effortless fairy tale version, where everything magically worked out, but rather the hard-won kind that came from choosing each other repeatedly through challenges and disagreements, from building trust through consistent action rather than grand gestures. They fought and made up, disappointed each other and forgave, grew and changed both individually and together, and their relationship became a model for what was possible when power was shared rather than contested. On their 25th anniversary as mates, Ilara stood once again on the palace balcony, looking out over the kingdom they had transformed together. She thought about the terrified Omega who had bled silver on a stone floor, and wondered what that girl would think if she could see what her life had become. She thought about all the wolves who had lived and died in the generations before her, primordials and Omegas, and anyone else who had been crushed beneath the weight of unjust hierarchy, and she hoped that the changes she had fought for honored their memory and justified their suffering. Kale found her there as he always did, drawn by the mate bond that connected them across any distance, and together they watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of silver and gold. They did not need words anymore to communicate what mattered, could feel each other's contentment and satisfaction flowing through the bond they shared. They had not solved every problem or eliminated every injustice, but they had proven that change was possible, that systems built on oppression could be dismantled and replaced with something better, and that love between equals was stronger than any power dynamic imposed by hierarchy. And that, Alara decided, was a legacy worth building, a story worth living, and a future worth fighting for. Her blood had always been silver even when she did not know it, carrying the legacy of those who came before, and the promise of those who would come after. And she had finally learned to embrace it fully rather than hiding it away. She was no longer invisible, no longer voiceless, no longer content to let others determine her worth or her place in the world. She was Queen Alara Nightshade, mate to the Alpha King, daughter of the primordials, an architect of a better future, and she wore all those identities with the same fierce pride that had carried her through every challenge she had faced. The wolves still bowed to her when her silver blood made itself known, but now it was out of genuine respect, rather than instinctive compulsion. And that made all the difference in the world. She had transformed from victim to survivor to leader, had taken the power that others feared, and used it to lift up those who needed it most. And in doing so, she had rewritten what it meant to be strong in a world that had forgotten strength, came in many forms. Her story was far from over, because there would always be new challenges and new injustices to confront. But she faced the future knowing that she was exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do, with exactly the right person by her side. And sometimes, late at night, when the palace was quiet, and it was just the two of them, Kyle would trace the silver veins that glowed faintly beneath her skin and tell her that he had waited 300 years to find her, that every lonely decade had been worth it for this. And Alara would believe him because the mate bond did not lie. They had found each other against impossible odds, had chosen to build something beautiful from the ruins of a broken system, and their love had become the foundation for transformation that would echo through generations. That was the true power of silver blood, not the abilities it granted, but the courage to use them in service of something greater than oneself. And Alara had finally learned to wield that power with the wisdom and compassion the primordials had always been meant to embody.